Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on making the required move to external Solr for new ArchivesSpace releases. I'm Jessica Crouch, the Community Engagement Coordinator for ArchivesSpace, and I'm joined today by ArchivesSpace Program Manager Christine DeBella, ArchivesSpace Tech Lead Brian Hoffman, and Mark Cooper, Tech Lead at Lyrasis, who also works with the ArchivesSpace team for development. In this webinar, ArchivesSpace team members will provide background information about this necessary change and walk attendees through some considerations for downloading and installing Solr. We're going to have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A after the brief presentation. We're going to hold all questions until that Q&A at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, I ask that you do use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen instead of the chat. Questions will be read and answered during the allocated time for Q&A. If you have a general question or you need some form of assistance, please feel free to reach out in the chat. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Christine.
Thanks, Jessica. This is Christine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of this move and some of the less technical details. And then I'm going to toss it over to Brian and Mark to get more into the technical side. So here's what we're planning to cover. We're planning to just talk a little bit about what Solr is and what it is in ArchivesSpace, why we're making this move now to needing external Solr, and then a little bit about installing and configuring it and some additional resources to help. So what is Solr? It's an open source search platform built on Apache Lucene. It's used by many different projects. It's versatile, it's scalable, it's got a large active community, and even like some of the projects that you probably use or know about use it. So things like Blacklight and Arclight, the Internet Archive, even Netflix. Within ArchivesSpace, Solr is the search engine, essentially. And when we talk, you hear us talk about indexes all the time. You hear us talk about the index. This is the part that we're talking about. When you're searching in the staff and the public interface, it's what determines the weighting in search results. Through the current version of ArchivesSpace, we were able to deploy Solr in a way where it could be embedded into releases of the application. But some people had already chosen to use external Solr. What external Solr means is that your ArchivesSpace points to an instance of Solr that's installed separately and lives outside of your ArchivesSpace instance. You can it's a different technology, but you can sort of think of it in the way that ArchivesSpace needs a MySQL database, and you have to install your MySQL database separately and hook it up to ArchivesSpace. Going forward, that's the way Solr will work. So why do we need to make this change now? ArchivesSpace has a number of dependencies in it. There's a number of different pieces of technology that make up the thing that we know of as ArchivesSpace. One of those pieces of technology is Solr. And ArchivesSpace has been on quite an old version of Solr. In fact, a version of Solr that was released in 2014. What has happened is that the version that we use operates differently from every other version of Solr that came after that. Solr is quite a few versions past the version of Solr that we use. So because of changes that were made by the maintainers of Solr, it's no longer embeddable. It has to be deployed externally from applications, including ArchivesSpace. Brian has put something there. If you're interested in the technical explanation of why they've made this change, that will explain a little bit about that. So there's some reasons why it's just not a good thing to stay, using what we're using, and why moving to external Solr is important. So staying on this old version, it's risky because Solr is not being supported. That version is not being supported anymore. The maintainers are not, making changes to it. They're not supporting it from a security standpoint, all these kinds of things that mean that it's a good idea to get off of older technology. Also, being on this older version has really kind of limited our ability to improve the search capabilities in the application. We're going to have a lot more potential moving up to a more current version to hopefully improve some things related to search. We did, because we know that this is going to be a disruption to people, it's going to be an inconvenience to people, we stayed on the older version as long as we could. We stayed using a paradigm where we could embed Solr as long as we could, but we really do need to move on now. And something of note, any of you in the audience that are using a hosting provider to manage your archive space, we're glad to have you here listening in, but your hosting provider is going to take care of this and manage Solr for you. I think this is a point that I will turn it over to Mark and Brian, who can talk a little bit about, there are some benefits to managing your own Solr. It's not just an inconvenience, there are some benefits. So I'm going to turn it over to them to talk a little bit about this and other things going forward.
Hi, everybody, this is Brian. Yeah, as Christine said, we really have our main motive is just that we're very kind of late in catching up to the current version of Solr, but there are advantages to doing this depending on your situation. Anyone who wants to use the kind of newer Solr cloud type of deployment, or who wants to use a Solr cluster, or who wants to like integrate their ArchivesSpace search into like a kind of bento type mixed backend search, would potentially be able to do that now, because we're going to be using the modern instance of Solr. And maybe we can go to the next slide.
Oh, no, I'll just, this is Mark. I'll just jump in with a benefit too. Because one thing that's probably been of concern to implementers that I've heard before, if you're already running external Solr, there being not much of a guarantee that your external Solr is working absolutely correctly. Like ArchivesSpace, the program team has offered no guarantee for that because of the embedded version. But now there's a bit more reassurance for people who have already made the switch to external Solr, because ArchivesSpace itself is doing that now. You have more of a guarantee there that everything is working correctly. You may not be precisely using the same version, but that's something we'll have documentation and information about as well in the future.
That's a really good point. And Mark has made some, like a very neat check that I think should actually be part of all Solr instances that will make ArchivesSpace kind of check that it's used, that the Solr configuration is in sync with that version of ArchivesSpace. So if you were already using your own Solr, there was the potential for you to get into trouble by having like a Solr schema that was not contemporary with your current database migration.
Mm-hmm.
So we can go forward. So there's a couple different options for people who are going to have to provide their own Solr service. One is to just install locally as per the standard instructions for your operating system. There are plenty of service providers that provide Solr as a service, similar to like Amazon type services, where you can pay a monthly fee and use that Solr instance. There are Ansible roles that you could use if you've already got a server provisioned and just want to turn it into a Solr server using Ansible. And likewise with Docker, there are lots of people running Solr as a Docker container. And Mark, if you want to add or move to the next slide.
Sure. Yeah, I think what this just demonstrates is that there's lots of different ways to do it, and all of those different ways would now be available to people. We won't be dictating how it's done. I think most of the documentation we provide, the support that we provide, will be kind of focused more around the idea that you've installed Solr locally following the documentation, and that would probably be in standalone mode, not using Solr Cloud or anything like that, because that's going to be all that the vast majority of ArchivesSpace deployments really need. But there are all these options. You may be using some of them already, or you may be looking to explore some of them. Yeah, Ansible is very popular in the library world for configuration management. So there are good existing Ansible roles already that can install Solr for you. So there are lots of options, and I'm sure people will like to discuss that sort of thing on the mailing list.
So we just wanted to give a very, very cursory overview of what this would mean in practice when that next big release comes out with this change. And just like a normal upgrade, you would stop ArchivesSpace and then install or otherwise provision Solr. And typically you wouldn't even need to change the configuration file. If you were running Solr on a strange port or something, you might need to add one line to your config file, and then starting Solr and starting ArchivesSpace. So I guess, yeah, I kind of skipped over those, but. Yeah, and just to point out that for this change, we're not really anticipating doing anything else different, but in the future, we might start taking advantage of some of the Solr features that we've been missing out on for several releases to improve performance or improve like complicated searches and things like that.
Yeah, so the emphasis that we've had initially, at least, is on trying to be as conservative as possible. So we're not making any big changes to ArchivesSpace's Solr schema while we're doing this transition. We're just trying to keep things as much the same as possible until this transition has happened for many ArchivesSpace sites, and then we can kind of look into what possibilities we have for actually improving how ArchivesSpace uses Solr. But in the short term, we're trying to keep things pretty minimal, just updating things where we have to resolve deprecations. But otherwise, it's going to function in a way that should be very transparent to your users. And I guess I'll speak about the slide. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So we have this list of resources. I don't know if you want to talk about any of the resources specifically.
So I think the thing to say right now is that we're going to provide documentation for how to use more documentation than is currently provided for how to use external Solr with ArchivesSpace. There's going to be a place in tech docs for that, and we'll be adding to that over the coming weeks and making sure that's available and in good shape by the time there's a release that necessitates this change for people. There's going to be at least one video tutorial that will give a live demonstration of installing Solr using external Solr with ArchivesSpace. And yeah, ArchivesSpace members are, of course, going to be able to get technical support, including on how to help get external Solr running.
I'll just add that if anyone has ever used an application like Blacklight or Arclight, this will be the exact same kind of situation. Nothing really different from those applications and how they require Solr.
So Jessica, I think that's all we have presentation.
Sounds good. We've got some questions in the Q&A, so I'll go ahead and start reading those. So yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A. What is the first version of ArchivesSpace requiring external Solr?
So there are a couple things here. We are working on, according to our roadmap, we're working towards an end of the year release. And this is anticipated to be in that end of the year release. We also are separately, we found a regression related to reorder mode in the last version of ArchivesSpace. So we are planning to put out a smaller release before that end of the year release. That smaller release will not require external Solr. So it really is the next big version of ArchivesSpace that is going to require this.
Thanks. Will ArchivesSpace provide a Docker Compose file to make installing ArchivesSpace, MySQL, Solr, and Docker easier?
Should I take that one?
Yeah, I was thinking, yes.
Well, I don't think we have like an official answer just yet, right? We're kind of evaluating, we're a small team, so we're kind of evaluating how much support we can reasonably provide. Obviously, we need to support a local installation following the Solr documentation, and that's going to be our emphasis. I don't think we can support every possible way that people can go about installing, ArchivesSpace's dependencies like Solr and MySQL. There's just too much and too many possible things that people can do. So we're not quite sure yet. We're still, if you have feedback on that and would like to give us your thoughts about that, we'd welcome them. We don't have a definitive answer right now. We've generally avoided so far kind of supporting any particular way other than kind of a standard way of kind of managing ArchivesSpace's dependencies. So, Docker is certainly something that people can use to, use with ArchivesSpace. Both of those things are pretty easy to do, but as to whether or not we'll support that, I don't think we have an answer just yet. Is there anything you want to add to that, Brian?
No, that sounds good. There is a Docker Compose file in our repository now if you're just looking to start up Solr. Isn't that right, Mark? But
yes, ArchivesSpace on the ArchivesSpace side internally, when doing development, we do use Docker for various things. We do publish a Docker image, but we're just currently, at least, we don't necessarily encourage the use of it because we're not fully sure about whether we can fully, provide support to the level that people would expect if we were kind of advocating it. So we're still figuring that out.
Thanks. There's another comment that says 1 vote for the Docker support. So I'll read that. Can we get the slides with the resource links? Yeah, a copy of the slides will be made available with the recording, and you will be able to find that on the webinar page of our website. What kind of improvements do you expect / hope to see with searching with newer Solr?
I wish I had a better answer, but I don't know exactly. Recently, one example is there was an issue where, and I can't remember the details of this issue, but I think we were having problems where 2 search terms, like adding a more restrictive search term was increasing the set of results, which was not what people expected. And there was some discussion at that point about what could be done with modern contemporary versions of Solr, but was not possible at that time. So whatever fix we made for that was like a provisional temporary fix. But there should be lots and lots of improvements since we're leaping so far forward with Solr.
Yeah, I think we have a task for in the future evaluating what more we can do using a newer version of Solr. Like we know that we can look at ArchivesSpace's schema and sort of refactor things a bit to take advantage of different data types and things like that. That's just not the emphasis right now. We kind of just want to get to a newer version first, and then we can sort of figure out how we can improve things going forward. But we can actually do that. That's the encouraging thing. Like right now, while for as long as we're stuck on the 4.10.4 end of life version, we'll never be able to do anything different than what that version is capable of. And that version's never going to get updates, security updates, feature enhancements, or anything. And at some point, we'll probably fail with newer versions of Java and some of the libraries that we're having to bundle. With the current ArchivesSpace's releases that we'll no longer have to do. So we're kind of focusing more on like just the technology, getting to a newer version, and then we can actually evaluate, what's possible and start improving things directly within the application. But for now, we're just being pretty conservative and just focusing on getting to the newer versions as a first step.
Cool, thanks. To configure Solr, for example, for the current ArchivesSpace version, should one use the Solr schema and Solr config files from the corresponding Git release?
The answer to that is no.
Oh.
I guess it depends how you look at it. So as part of the documentation, what we'll be doing with ArchivesSpace releases from when this transition happens, the Solr configured files that you need to provide to Solr will actually be part of the release. They'll be available when you download ArchivesSpace. There will be a folder called Solr, and it will have the files you need to use to configure Solr for ArchivesSpace provided there, and the instructions will talk about how you would use those to set up your Solr. So you won't have to go to GitHub to get files. They'll actually be part of the ArchivesSpace release package.
Okay, cool. We are on version 2.7.1. Before moving on to the new release that requires external Solr, should we go ahead and configure our 2.7.1 version to run with external Solr?
I don't think that there would be any advantage to doing that.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely up to you. It's not required at all. It's possible for you to do that. You could maybe explore doing that as a way to get ahead of when this thing happens. You've already kind of gone through the process and you understand it better, but it's certainly not required to do it at this time.
Gotcha. All right. Does external mean remote? Is it okay to install Solr locally on the same server as ArchivesSpace, or is that not recommended?
That's completely fine. You can do it that way. External just means outside of ArchivesSpace, whereas before it was embedded, it was actually included in ArchivesSpace. Now it's external. It's separate from ArchivesSpace, but you can absolutely run it on the same server as ArchivesSpace.
All right. And then Joshua Shaw suggests making a repo or some kind of resource available where people can list, describe, or link to their alternate install methods, kind of like Awesome ArchivesSpace does for resources. That's a good idea.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, we're all caught up on the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in now. I'm going to wait and speak slowly for a second to see if any questions pop up. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Oh, we've got one. How are folks already using external Solr defining their schema and configuration?
I don't know if someone who fits that description can answer, but I would assume that they are just copying the Solr config and schema files that ship with ArchivesSpace and creating a collection in their instance of Solr with those.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, that I assume that's what people are doing. You wouldn't be able to just do that and have it work. You'd have to make some changes. But I assume that people who are doing external Solr currently have figured out those changes and have it working.
Nathan, I don't know if you have access to the listserv. You could always post a question like that there and get responses from users. The changes in ArchivesSpace and GitHub seem to be targeting Solr version 8. Will earlier major versions of Solr be supported?
I guess I can answer that, or well, I can try to answer that. I don't want to speak for the program team fully on this because I don't think we've pinned down all of the criteria exactly for the support that we're delivering. Like, we will support the version that ArchivesSpace is referencing, of course. If you're somewhere in between the old version, which you could be running externally, just the 4.10.4 version, and the version that ArchivesSpace is being developed and tested with, I don't know that we're committing to support for that as such, but we, like I was saying about the methodology we're taking right now being very conservative, we're making minimal changes in order to get ArchivesSpace working with the latest version of Solr, so that at this point, I don't see a problem with being in between. If you've already got external Solr working with ArchivesSpace, that should continue to be fine. And if there ever comes a point when that wouldn't be, that'd be part of some broader thing that we're changing in terms of the schema or the configuration, which we're not doing currently. So we believe right now that if you're on version 6 or version 7, and you've made the changes to get ArchivesSpace working with those versions, they should continue to work, and you can continue to use them.
All right, thanks. Okay, we're all caught up on the Q&A again. So once again, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them now. But if we don't have any in the next few seconds, we'll go ahead and wrap up. There's a question. Sorry if you mentioned this. Are you developing for 8.10 or 8.1.0 or 8.10?
Yes, 8.10.
And then Christine saw, can you show the second step slide that passed by quickly? Yeah.
Yeah, so this was just intended to be a very sort of high level kind of description of what most people will be doing to transition to external Solr as part of an ArchivesSpace upgrade. So some of the steps are obviously kind of like your normal steps when doing an upgrade. You stop ArchivesSpace and so on. Picking up from here. So when you start Solr, you then have to create what, if you're in standalone mode, they call a Solr core, which is just the place where your data lives in your configuration. There's like a command, a Solr command that you will use that will create that using the ArchivesSpace configuration files that we provide through the release package. And we'll have documentation for this. Hopefully it's a pretty simple process. Step 5, the ensure Solr URL is correct in the config file. For most people, you wouldn't even have to set this. It's going to be correct by default. If you do change like Solr's port or something like that, or if you just want to be sure that you're using the right URL, you might want to specify it and not rely on the default. We'll have instructions for that. And then because we're upgrading and there's a newer version of the Lucene being used, we're going to reindex ArchivesSpace as well. And the simplest method to do that will just be deleting the current indexer state files. Your Solr index will be empty because you've just set it up for the first time. You delete the indexer state files and then ArchivesSpace will reindex when it starts up.
All right, thanks. All right, no other questions in the Q&A. Every time I say it, it brings a question. Should the external Solr be protected with a password?
That's going to be entirely up to you. I think that's kind of the thing with external Solr, like you're going to be able to do whatever you want to do on that level, so long as it works with ArchivesSpace. Traditionally, ArchivesSpace doesn't use a password to access Solr for embedded, and when you're following the standard install instructions, you probably won't see any reference to passwords, but if you follow the Solr documentation and it provides the instructions on how to do things like that, you should be able to do any of those things.
All right, thanks. Okay, we're back to no questions in the Q&A. Any last minute thoughts from our presenters or anything that you'd like to clarify before we wrap up? All right, I'm not seeing anyone unmute themselves. So we'll go ahead and wrap up now. Thank you to everyone for coming to this this webinar, and a recording of the webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel and our website with a copy of the slides, so you can grab those resources. And like we've said, there's going to be additional documentation about this, more announcements to come, and at least one screencast to help make this transition a little bit easier. But in the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email the team at archivespace@lyrasis.org. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing all of you at the next ArchivesSpace event. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks.